The next part of the axial skeleton, since we've completed the skull, would be the vertebral column. So on your little model, you can take a look at this. Now it is articulated for you, and you can do some counting on your own, but I have some disarticulated pieces that I can show you some individual vertebrae. So when you think of the vertebrae, they're really meant to be a framework for the body, but they're also surrounding and protecting the spinal cord, which would be a very delicate nervous system structure, and we haven't really talked about that yet. And they're going to connect that spinal cord to the brain so that they can communicate. So when we look at the parts or the regions of the vertebral column, if you look in your manual on page 151, you'll see a diagram where it's got different regions, and you'll also notice the curvature, and it's a little difficult for me to show you on the model, but I think the image will show you that very nicely. Whenever I take a look at the vertebrae, you can see some really distinct differences between the sizes and shapes of those vertebrae. The vertebrae towards the top are called cervical vertebrae. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, or neck vertebrae. They're a little more delicate. They're doing the job of supporting the skull, but they're not really going to be supporting the rest of the body, so they don't need to be quite as large. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and the thoracic vertebrae would be attaching to the ribs. So they're going to be recognizable because they have facets that allow those ribs to attach. And then this very large, the one that I held up earlier, very large lumbar vertebrae. There are 5 of those, and they're distinguishable by the really large structure and that function of support. So 7, 12, and 5, think of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, cervical, thoracic, and then lumbar vertebrae. The next region is actually a collection of fused vertebrae, and it's sort of a heart shape if you use your imagination. And that's called the sacrum. So you can see the sacrum on your model, and then this is a more sort of typical life-sized sacrum. And then finally, and I didn't dig it out of here it is, the coccyx, which sort of looks like a rattlesnake in this model, but there are 3 to 5 fused vertebrae here. The coccyx is probably better known as the tailbone. And if you think about it, if you notice in this model, the curvature, if you plunk down, you're ice skating or roller skating or something like that, and you plunk down on that, you can break the tip of that off, and of course it's painful and somewhat difficult to do anything. You kind of have to wait for that to heal on its own. So cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx, and it illustrates those for you individually. The only other thing I would mention that in your model, it's not very clear, but those are separated by little wedges of cartilage called intervertebral discs. Now this is plastic, so it's not really an intervertebral disc, but it gives you a sense of those little cushions. They're actually mostly fibrocartilage, a very tough cartilage to help protect the underlying vertebrae, cushion and protect those, because of course you have a lot of movements along that vertebral column. Okay, so the vertebral column, those different regions and different structures of the vertebrae themselves. When we think of those thoracic vertebrae that I mentioned, the 12 thoracic vertebrae, they're attaching to the ribs, so we'll just go right into the ribs next. You have 12 pairs of ribs, and there are different regions here as well, and it has to do with how they attach or don't attach to the sternum, which is that little dagger-shaped bone, the breastbone as it's sometimes called. So, not this one. This one's the clavicle. This is actually part of your appendicular skeleton. But if we begin with these different ribs, the first 7 pairs of ribs attach to the sternum. And so they're sometimes called true ribs. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest are fake ribs, but that's just the name that's been given because they attach to the thoracic vertebrae on the posterior side, and they attach directly to the sternum in the front. The next several pairs 8, 9, and 10, actually fuse together before they would attach, and so those are sometimes called the false ribs. Again, it doesn't mean that they're not real, it's just that the way that they're attaching to the sternum is to fuse together first. And then pairs 11 and 12 are sometimes called the floating ribs because they really don't come the whole way around to the front. They do articulate with the thoracic vertebrae in the back, but then they sort of just hang out there. So the rib cage, of course, is designed to protect and enclose the lungs. There are little muscles between these ribs called the intercostal muscles, and those are important during respiration. The sternum itself has some regions. The kind of widened region, if you think of it like a dagger, the handle of the dagger, if you will, is called the manubrium, N-A-N-U-B-R-I-U-M. The body, the main component of the sternum, and then this little tip is called the xiphoid process. So the xiphoid process, maybe you're aware of it if you've ever learned CPR. You want to make sure that you don't kind of press on that and break that off and puncture someone's lung, do more damage than good. But CPR is still a good skill, and I'm not saying not to learn it. You should learn it, but I'm always aware of that xiphoid process when I think of CPR. So with that, that completes the axial skeleton, the skull, the vertebral column, the ribs, and the sternum. So with that, then we'll move on to appendicular. As I was putting the bones away, I realized I wanted to mention this kind of unique bone. It's sort of a horseshoe-shaped bone. It actually fits, I won't do it or I'll choke myself, but it actually fits under your tongue. It's called the hyoid bone, H-Y-O-I-D. It's somewhat difficult to see in the specimen that you have, which is why I wanted to make sure I mentioned it. It's not really shown there. The hyoid bone is really the only disarticulated bone. It anchors the tongue and it does assist with swallowing. It's often the bone that would be broken during a strangulation, so it could be used to help with some forensic biology to see how someone had a certain cause of death. But it's sort of interesting because it does disarticulate and because it wasn't shown clearly on your model, the hyoid bone.